Welcome, my friends, to another evening of cozy intrigue. Tonight, we open the pages of the murder hidden in the recipe book, where gentle village life blends with whispers of danger. Imagine winter frost glittering on hedgerows, the scent of freshly baked bread lingering in a warm kitchen, and the distant chime of church bells. Yet, behind all this peace lies a puzzle only keen eyes can untangle. Before we begin, I'd love to know, when the nights grow long, do you prefer tea, coffee, or a steaming mug of cocoa? Let me know below as we settle in. The autumn dusk settled gently over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in hues of gold and rose. Smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys, carrying with it the comforting scent of wood fires and suppers simmering on stoves. Windows glowed warmly, framing scenes of families gathering around tables, children finishing their lessons, and neighbors stopping for a word at garden gates. All seemed calm, just as it always had, an ordinary evening in an ordinary village. Yet, the quiet beauty held its shadows. In one such kitchen, a recipe book lay forgotten upon a scrubbed wooden table. Its pages, browned at the edges with age and dotted with splashes of jam, told stories of countless puddings, pies, and Sunday roasts. But between the familiar stains lurked something far less innocent, dark, rusty blotches that did not resemble jam at all. The book seemed to whisper a secret, waiting for the right pair of eyes to notice. And of course, there was someone who did. From the lane outside, Miss Marple passed with her knitting bag in hand. Her gaze, sharp behind the gentleness, caught details others overlooked. Where most saw comfort, she detected the faintest trace of unease. Chapter 1. A Village of Calm and Shadows. St. Mary Mead was a sort of village that seemed, at first glance, perfectly content to stay unchanged forever. Its cottages stood in neat rows, their gardens bursting with dahlias and late-blooming roses, while the church bells marked the hours with a steady, reassuring rhythm. The high street was modest but proud, a grocer with apples stacked in polished pyramids, a tea room where scones emerged warm from the oven, and a post office that doubled as the very hub of conversation. Hey, nothing escaped the gentle scrutiny of neighbors. A newcomer's choice of hat, or parcel arriving at an unusual hour, could fuel half a day's gossip. Yet beneath this cozy rhythm of life lay murmurs that didn't quite belong. A quarrel between two shopkeepers lingered in lowered voices behind the counter. A window was seen lit well past midnight in a house where its owner claimed early bedtimes. Even the vicar, normally so cheerful, appeared oddly distracted during his morning walk, fumbling with his prayer book as though burdened by some unspoken worry. To most villagers, these were passing curiosities, no more than the spice that flavored small-town life. But for those with sharper eyes, there was something faintly unsettling about the way shadows stretched a little longer in St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself held its breath, waiting. And in the quiet heart of this place, Miss Marple, with her knitting needles and calm presence, noticed what others chose to dismiss. The following Saturday brought the much-anticipated church fundraiser, a tradition as old as the village itself. By mid-morning, the hall was fragrant with the mingled scents of sponge cakes, warm loaves, and sugared tarts, while trestle tables groaned under the weight of homemade offerings. Villagers bustled in with pride, each eager to display their particular specialty: Mrs. Bartlett's famous seed cake, young Ivy Sims's ambitious cherry pie, and the vicar's wife's jam turnovers that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. The chatter of voices, punctuated by bursts of laughter, created a hum of easy contentment. It was the sort of scene that might have been lifted straight from a postcard. Aprons dusted with flour, kettles hissing in the corner, children sneaking biscuits when they thought no one was looking. Yet, as often happens in St. Mary Mead, something curious occurred amid the cheer. A small, well-thumbed recipe book exchanged hands near the far end of the hall. No one remarked upon it. It seemed little more than a practical detail, a neighbor lending notes on pastry techniques to another. But Miss Marple noticed. From her place by the teacups, she watched as the book was tucked quickly into a wicker basket, almost hidden beneath a folded cloth. The gesture was hurried, faintly secretive, and entirely unnecessary for an innocent recipe. Her mind, ever cataloging such peculiarities, stored the moment away. The bake sale rolled on merrily, coins clinking into donation tins and plates wiped clean. Yet, behind the sweetness of sugared buns and the merriment of raffles, a thread of unease had been woven. The recipe book, so modest in appearance, would soon prove to hold more than culinary wisdom. It would carry the first whisper of a darker tale. Though the bake sale carried on with cheerful bustle, Miss Marple's sharp eyes began to detect ripples beneath the surface. She noticed, for instance, the vicar, normally the very picture of calm benevolence, glancing nervously toward the doorway every few minutes, as though expecting someone who never arrived. His smile, though unfailingly polite, seemed forced, his hands fumbling with the raffle tickets until they tore untidily in his grasp. To anyone else, it was nothing more than mild distraction. To Miss Marple, it hinted at a mind preoccupied. Nearby, the recently widowed Mrs. Alderton stood by her lemon drizzle cake, speaking in a voice carefully measured, as though she weighed each word before letting it slip. When praised for her baking, she offered a smile that never quite reached her eyes. More than once, she avoided questions about her late husband's treasured cookbook, redirecting the conversation to something trivial. Her guarded tone suggested that grief was not the only burden she carried. And then, of course, there was the recipe book itself. Miss Marple caught another glimpse of it as the cloth in the wicker basket shifted. Brown leather corners, pages feathered from use, and a faint stain darkening the edge. The woman who had tucked it away did so with such haste that it was almost furtive, glancing over her shoulder as though to ensure no one had noticed. Most villagers were far too caught up in the merriment to observe these subtleties. They tasted sponge, traded gossip, and filled the hall with laughter. But Miss Marple, with her quiet demeanor and ever-busy knitting fingers, had cultivated the art of listening more than speaking, of watching without intruding. To her, the bake sale was not just an afternoon of cakes and camaraderie. It was a stage where small, revealing gestures betrayed the hidden tensions of St. Mary Mead. And as she sipped her tea, she sensed that something far darker than jam stains was beginning to seep through the village's genteel surface. Chapter 2. The first clue emerges. By the following morning, a strange unease had settled over St. Mary Mead. The village baker, Mr. Henry Abbott, had not opened his shop. His absence was immediately felt. No scent of fresh loaves wafted down the lane. No clatter of trays behind the small-paned windows. For a man whose punctuality was as dependable as the sunrise, such silence was startling. At first, villagers reassured themselves. Perhaps he had overslept, or fallen ill with nothing more serious than a chill. But when the church bell tolled 10 and the bakery door remained locked, worry began to ripple through the streets. Mrs. Bartlett remarked that she had seen him leave the bake sale late the previous evening, carrying his usual wicker basket. Young Ivy swore she noticed something tucked inside it, a small, battered book with stained pages. By noon, speculation had taken hold. Some whispered of debts, others of a secret love affair pulling him away. A few, more dramatic, suggested foul play, though such notions seemed unthinkable in their quiet village. Still, the gossip spread with an eagerness only small towns possess, each retelling twisting the story into new shapes. Miss Marple, listening quietly from her garden gate, took note of the details others dismissed. Mr. Abbott was steady, reliable, and fond of his routines, Sudden disappearances were not in his nature. And that recipe book, the same one she had seen hurriedly concealed, seemed to hover at the edges of every recollection. While others comforted themselves with fanciful theories, Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened into a question. What secret lay between the missing baker and that innocuous-looking book? Whatever the answer, she felt certain the village had just stepped onto the first thread of a far more tangled web. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat by her small round table, the teapot steaming gently beside her and a plate of shortbread within easy reach. To anyone passing her cottage window, it would have seemed the picture of domestic calm, an elderly lady enjoying her tea. Yet behind her serene expression, her mind was quietly unraveling threads others had chosen not to tug. She recalled Mr. Abbott's laughter at the bake sale, just a shade too quick, too brittle, as though he were laughing not from amusement but from nerves. She thought again of the recipe book, its pages stained with more than jam, and of how hastily it had been concealed. Small things, easily dismissed by those inclined to believe life in the village was always tidy and safe. But Miss Marple had long observed that human nature rarely behaved tidily. She compared it to her roses in the garden, outwardly beautiful, yet always harboring thorns beneath the petals. People, too, often dressed their troubles in polite smiles and cheerful chatter, hiding what pricked and festered beneath. And when such secrets pressed too heavily, they showed themselves in odd little ways. Nervous laughter, distracted glances, or a recipe book placed just so. Pouring herself another cup, Miss Marple admitted she did not yet know what these peculiarities meant. But she knew enough to trust that such details, however small, were never accidents. They were signposts, if one only took the time to read them. The next morning, the market square was abuzz with speculation. Stalls brimmed with late autumn produce, apples polished to a shine, baskets of root vegetables, jars of honey gleaming amber in the pale sun. But it was not the goods that drew villagers together in eager knots of conversation. It was Mr. Abbott's disappearance. Near the greengrocer's cart, Mrs. Bartlett whispered with theatrical gravity that she had heard Mr. Abbott had run off with a woman from the next town. "Love makes fools of men," she declared, adjusting her hat as though she herself were above such folly. Ivy Sims, overhearing, protested that Mr. Abbott was far too respectable for that sort of scandal. She suggested instead that he had fallen into debts, driven away by shame. At the fishmonger's, someone else speculated that illness had struck him suddenly, and that he was lying in bed too weak to call for help. Each theory grew more elaborate as it passed from one mouth to another, like dough being kneaded until unrecognizable from its original form. Through it all, Miss Marple wandered quietly from stall to stall, her basket over her arm, her ears open. She knew well that gossip was not without its uses. In every tale, no matter how exaggerated, there lingered a kernel of truth, if one was patient enough to sift through the chaff. She noted, for instance, how several people mentioned seeing Mr. Abbott with his wicker basket that evening, though the details blurred from one retelling to the next. The battered recipe book, glimpsed by some, became a fleeting curiosity, often laughed away as nothing of consequence. After all, who would believe that a book of puddings and pies could hold importance in a man's disappearance? But Miss Marple did not laugh. She tucked the detail away with quiet certainty. Human nature, she reflected, had a habit of hiding its most telling truths in the places others least expected. And perhaps, within the margins of that humble recipe book, the story of Mr. Abbott's fate was waiting to be read. Chapter 3. The Recipe Book Secrets. 2 days after Mr. Abbott's disappearance, the village stirred with fresh commotion. The baker's cottage, once filled with the aroma of warm bread and sugared buns, now stood silent and shuttered. At last, the constable, urged on by persistent neighbors, forced the door and allowed a small group inside. Miss Marple, of course, managed to be present, ostensibly to deliver flowers for the windowsill, though in truth her curiosity was far deeper. The cottage revealed little at first glance. Loaves left unfinished had gone stale upon the counter, and flour dust clung to every surface, as if time itself had halted the moment Mr. Abbott vanished. But in the bedroom, beneath loose floorboards near the wardrobe, something curious came to light. A slim recipe book, tucked away as though meant never to be found. It was no ordinary household companion. Its pages, fragile with age, bore more than the neat instructions for sponge or treacle tart. Many entries were incomplete, cut off midline or filled with peculiar annotations, strange symbols, numbers, and words that did not belong in any recipe. There were margins filled with hurried scribbles, and some pages soiled with dark, irregular stains. The constable flipped through it carelessly, dismissing the oddities with a shrug. "Just kitchen nonsense," he muttered, uninterested in jam splatters and smudged ink. But Miss Marple's fingers lingered upon the cover. To her, it was never nonsense when things hid themselves in plain sight. As the group departed, murmuring disappointment, she cradled the memory of that book in her mind. Recipes, after all, were meant to nourish and comfort, but this one whispered of something else entirely, as if within its worn pages lay the first true key to unlocking the mystery of Henry Abbott's fate. That evening, as the village lights winked out one by one, Miss Marple sat by her lamp with a cup of cocoa, her thoughts fixed on the curious little book hidden beneath Mr. Abbott's floorboards. She had only glimpsed its pages briefly, yet even that moment had revealed more than most would notice. The handwriting, for instance, spidery, angular, and uneven, was quite unlike the baker's rounded, tidy script she had often seen on his shop's chalkboard. No, these entries were the work of another hand altogether. She turned the matter over in her mind with the same patient diligence she used to unravel a knot in her knitting yarn. Why would a man as straightforward as Henry Abbott conceal a book filled with words he had not written? And why disguise those words as harmless recipes? To most, it was baffling. To Miss Marple, however, it rang with familiarity. During the war, she had once helped decode messages woven into the most ordinary of things, knitting patterns, shopping lists, even hymnals. Human nature, she mused, had a way of cloaking dangerous intentions within the folds of everyday life. The recipe book's odd substitutions, the half-finished instructions, the numbers scrawled in margins, they bore all the marks of a ledger or cipher, not of a kitchen companion. She remembered, too, the hurried way it had been passed at the bake sale, as though someone feared discovery. Taken altogether, the conclusion was plain. The book was no innocent collection of puddings and pies, but a vessel for secrets, one that had somehow drawn Mr. Abbott into its shadow. Closing her eyes for a moment, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh. She could feel the shape of the puzzle forming, though its full picture remained obscured. And, as always, she knew the devil would be found in the smallest of details. The following afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to glance through the curious book once more, the constable having little interest in it beyond keeping the villagers quiet. She turned the fragile pages with care, scanning the neat lists of flour, sugar, and eggs, ordinary enough, until her eyes settled upon one recipe that caused her knitting fingers to still. It appeared to be for a simple fruit tart, but among the familiar ingredients was an unmistakable anomaly: nightshade berries. The words were written plainly, without flourish, as though they belonged there as naturally as currants or plums. To anyone else, it might have seemed a childish mistake. To Miss Marple, it was chilling. Nightshade was no fruit to be baked into a tart. Its berries were poisonous, lethal in small doses, their glossy black skins tempting to the unwary. She had once read of their use in old apothecary practices and recalled, during her girlhood, a village child who had nearly died from sampling the shiny berries on a dare. To see them tucked into a recipe suggested something deliberate, something sinister. Her mind began to assemble the pieces. The widow's guarded tone, the baker's brittle laughter, the unexplained stains upon the pages. Was it possible that someone had been experimenting, hiding instructions in plain sight, testing poison beneath the guise of household cooking? And if so, had Mr. Abbott stumbled too close to the truth? She closed the book softly, her lips pressed in a thin line. Recipes were meant to sustain life, to comfort and bring families together. Yet this recipe carried death between its lines, masquerading as sweetness. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple thought, a hand had already mixed danger into the most ordinary of ingredients. And if they had dared to write it so boldly, she feared they might have already tested its effects upon the unsuspecting. Chapter 4: Secrets in Plain Sight. Just as the stir over Mr. Abbott's disappearance was beginning to fade into uneasy silence, the village was struck by another blow. Old Mr. Pritchard, a retired schoolmaster known for his stern manner and fondness for jam tarts, was found lifeless in his armchair only 3 days after the bake sale. His housekeeper, weeping into her apron, told anyone who would listen that he had died peacefully in his sleep. The doctor, a harried man with little patience for drama, declared it a natural passing, age and a weak heart, nothing more. The funeral was swift, the whole village gathering beneath a gray sky to pay their respects. Black coats and veils moved solemnly through the churchyard, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. To most, it was a sad but unsurprising event. Mr. Pritchard had not been young, after all. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly near the back with her hymn-bit closed, felt a prickle of unease. She recalled seeing Mr. Pritchard at the bake sale, laughing heartily as he sampled a slice of cake. There'd be nothing frail about him then. And now, as she looked upon his face in the coffin, she noticed a faint discoloration about the lips, a bluish tinge not explained by old age. Her sharp eyes also caught the timing, the death occurring so soon after the bake sale, so soon after that troubling recipe book had surfaced. Others murmured prayers and exchanged condolences. Miss Marple, however, tightened her grip upon her gloves. She knew human nature too well to dismiss coincidence so easily. Somewhere behind the solemn hymns and the soft fall of soil on the grave, she could almost hear the whisper of poison, quiet, patient, and deadly, threading its way through St. Mary Mead. When Miss Marple first voiced her unease to the local authorities, she was met with indulgent smiles. The constable, a stout fellow with little imagination, insisted that Mr. Pritchard's death was nothing but the natural course of things. Elderly men pass away every day, Miss Marple, he said kindly, as though addressing a fretful aunt. We can't go chasing shadows. But Miss Marple was not one to be easily set aside. With her gentle manner and quiet persistence, she began to seek answers elsewhere. She visited Mrs. Bartlett under the pretense of borrowing sugar and casually inquired about the bake sale. The woman chatted readily, but when Miss Marple asked who had last spoken to Mr. Abbott, Mrs. Bartlett grew flustered, fumbling with her apron strings. At the vicarage, the Reverend himself denied noticing anything unusual, though his eyes darted toward the shelves where the church records were kept. Miss Marple tucked that detail away, saying nothing. Later, she encountered Mrs. Alderton, the widow, who laughed too loudly when asked about the recipe book, dismissing it as silly gossip before quickly changing the subject to her roses. Each conversation offered no confession, no proof, only small hesitations, nervous glances, and hurried diversions. Yet Miss Marple knew well that truth often revealed itself not in what was said, but in what was carefully avoided. By evening, she returned to her cottage no closer to answers, yet more certain than ever. The village held its secrets close, but she had lived too long among human frailties to be fooled. Somewhere between those polite denials lay the key to Mr. Pritchard's death, and perhaps to the baker's disappearance as well. One afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Alderton, the recently widowed woman who had been so guarded at the bake sale. She brought along a jar of her own marmalade, an innocent enough excuse for a visit, and found the widow in her sitting room, donning a pair of gloves by the fire. The atmosphere was cozy, almost too carefully arranged, as though comfort itself had been staged. They spoke pleasantly at first. Mrs. Alderton remarked on the weather, on the vicar's sermon, and on how difficult it was to manage the house alone. Her tone was warm enough, but her eyes flickered with a nervous brightness. Miss Marple, nodding and knitting as always, let the conversation drift where it might, never pressing too hard. It was when they discussed the bake sale that the slip occurred. Mrs. Alderton laughed lightly, recalling how Mr. Pritchard had eaten too much sponge cake. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Of course, I dare say that page about the berries was never meant to be taken seriously. Henry was far too cautious for that sort of thing." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. The widow had spoken as though she had read the recipe book herself, yet it had been hidden beneath Mr. Abbott's floorboards, discovered only days after his disappearance. Very few had glimpsed its strange contents, and certainly not in enough detail to know about the dangerous berries. But Miss Marple, true to form, betrayed no surprise. She merely smiled, offered another marmalade sandwich, and let the conversation wander back to rosies and parish news. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, however, she marked the widow's words with precision. It was not proof, not yet, but it was the first solid thread tying Mrs. Alderton to the sinister heart of the mystery. Chapter 5. The Web Tightens. The village of St. Mary Mead was rarely awake past 9 o'clock. By 10, curtains were drawn, lamps extinguished, and only the owls in the hedgerows kept watch. Yet on this particular evening, Miss Marple lingered by her own window, knitting in her lap, eyes turned toward Mrs. Alderton's cottage across the lane. Age had never dulled her curiosity, nor her instinct to observe when others slept. The widow's cottage, usually dark by 8:30, showed a wavering light well past 10. From her vantage point, Miss Marple noticed shadows flitting across the curtains. 2 figures, not one. She watched as the silhouette of Mrs. Alderton moved swiftly, almost furtively, to the door. Moments later, another shape appeared, a man carrying what looked very much like a parcel. Their voices could not be heard, but their gestures spoke of urgency. The man left as quickly as he arrived, and the widow's lamp was dimmed. But not before Miss Marple glimpsed something telling. The shape of Mrs. Alderton stooping before her pantry, lifting the rug, and sliding the parcel into some hidden recess beneath the floorboards. Miss Marple leaned back, hands folded neatly. To anyone else, it might seem an innocuous late visit or the delivery of provisions. Yet the widow's secrecy, at such an hour and in such a manner, whispered of concealment, not domestic routine. She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet night, but her mind was already arranging these fragments like pieces of a puzzle. Packages at midnight, hidden under pantry floors, and the curious mention of berries from the recipe book. The threads were tightening, and Miss Marple, with her patient eye, was prepared to follow them wherever they led. The following afternoon, a chance discovery brought the mystery into sharper focus. Young Tommy Briggs, ever eager to impress, had been helping his uncle repair a loose board in the vestry storeroom when he stumbled upon a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. Thinking it nothing more than rubbish, he carried it straight to the vicar, perplexed by its strange contents, quietly sought Miss Marple's advice. Within the bundle lay a second book, this one smaller than the recipe collection but bound in much the same way. Its pages were not filled with sponge cakes and puddings, but with odd pairings of ingredients and cryptic notes. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed a jumble of nonsensical recipes, elderberry cordial laced with chalk, custards with suspicious powders, jams requiring tinctures never sold in the grocer's shop. But to Miss Marple, the pattern was unmistakable. The book was a ledger, carefully disguised. Beside each recipe were initials, dates, and small sums of money. A few recipes bore ominous annotations: bitter, too quick, or slower, unnoticed. The implication chilled her more than the autumn wind seeping through the vestry door. Here was not the art of cooking, but the art of experimenting. Poisons tested, their effects recorded, their costs tallied like any ordinary business. Even more troubling were the names that appeared in shorthand among the pages. While not explicit, Miss Marple could tease out enough to see the shapes of debts, quiet payoffs, and hints of blackmail. At the center of many entries was a simple A, and more often than not, the sums were followed by the notation word. The ledger pointed toward Mrs. Alderton with unsettling clarity. Yet motives remained veiled. Was she experimenting for money, protecting secrets, or silencing those who might betray her? Miss Marple closed the book with deliberate care. The recipes had been a mask. The true account lay here, in this hidden ledger, a chilling record that made plain what village gossip could never quite name. The widow, it seemed, was not merely a bystander. She was woven into the very fabric of the crime. The widow's cottage smelled of lavender polish and freshly baked sponge when Miss Marple called the following afternoon. Mrs. Alderton, all smiles and fluttering hands, seemed almost too eager to welcome her guest. "Do sit, dear Miss Marple," she urged, producing a plate of golden cake dusted with sugar. "I insisted on baking fresh this morning. One mustn't let sorrow keep one idle." Miss Marple accepted the tea with a gracious nod, but quietly let the plate of cake rest untouched before her. "You are most kind," she said, her blue eyes mild yet unwavering. She sipped, listening as Mrs. Alderton chattered of church matters and the state of her garden, every word delivered with practiced ease. But beneath the surface, the widow's composure frayed. She spoke of the bake sale as though in passing, yet her phrasing betrayed too much detail. The order of who brought what, even the mention of the jam stains on the recipe book. A curious slip, for Miss Marple had never said anything of stains. When gently asked about her late-night visitors, Mrs. Alderton's hand trembled, spilling a few drops of tea upon her saucer. She quickly disguised it with a nervous laugh, but Miss Marple caught the tightening of her jaw. "Such a busy village," Miss Marple murmured pleasantly, folding her napkin. "And yet, so many secrets find their way to the surface, don't you think?" The widow's smile flickered. For the briefest moment, her eyes darted toward the pantry door. Miss Marple rose with quiet dignity, leaving the cake untouched. Confirmation did not require confession. It lay in the tremor of a hand, the slip of a tongue, and the fear in a woman's eyes. The truth, she knew, was drawing near. Chapter 6. The Unveiling. The vicarage drawing-room was warm with lamplight, its air filled with the scent of beeswax and the faint creak of old furniture. Villagers gathered in small clusters, murmuring with curiosity over why Miss Marple had requested their company. The vicar, ever obliging, poured sherry and encouraged everyone to sit. Into this cozy atmosphere, Miss Marple's gentle voice began to weave a tale. She did not speak with accusation, but with the calm clarity of one describing the turning of seasons. "You will recall the bake sale," she began, "and the recipe book that so curiously passed from hand to hand. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than a collection of puddings and pies. but one page spoke of nightshade berries, which no one in this room would mistake for anything but poison. A hush fell. Even the clink of glass ceased as her words settled like frost upon the company. Miss Marple continued, recounting the baker's disappearance, the sudden funeral, and the curious slips of speech overheard in the market. Each detail was presented as though part of a simple domestic anecdote, yet the pattern began to gleam unmistakably. When she gently noted the odd familiarity certain villagers displayed with the book-stained pages, eyes flickered uneasily across the room. The widow sat rigid, her fingers knotting the lace handkerchief in her lap. Miss Marple concluded not with triumph, but with quiet gravity. "You see, my days, in human nature, just as in gardening, what is sown in secrecy will surely sprout, however carefully one tries to cover the earth." The room held its breath. The story was not yet finished, but its outline was unmistakable, and every villager, from vicar to widow, now leaned forward, waiting for the final unmasking. At first, the widow tried to hold her composure. Her lips curved in a brittle smile, and she muttered something about idle gossip and old women's tales. Yet the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting folded neatly on her lap, did not push or raise her tone. She merely observed, allowing the silence of the vicarage to press down upon the room like a tightening net. Finally, the widow's defenses faltered. Her eyes darted wildly, as though searching for a sympathetic face, but found only wary stares. Her voice broke. "It was never meant to go so far," she whispered, clutching her handkerchief. "The money, the accounts at the church were falling short, and I thought no one would notice if I shifted things around. But Henry, poor Henry," he began to ask questions. Gasps rippled across the room. She continued, words tumbling now, as though once loose they could not be contained. "The recipe book was clever. You see, no one questions a housewife scribbles of flour and sugar. But the notes weren't recipes at all. They were reminders, debts owed, threats received, the way to keep mouths shut. And when Henry pressed me, well, I had read enough to know which berries would stop his prying." Her face crumpled, the facade of respectability gone. "I only meant to silence him. Then others began to see, to suspect. And so, I wove it deeper, thinking I could still control it." The widow's confession hung heavy in the lamplight, chilling the once cozy room. No one spoke. It was Miss Marple, quiet and resolute, who finally broke the silence. "Evil, my dear, rarely begins with grand designs. More often, it is the smallest selfishness that grows unchecked until it poisons everything around it." The following morning, the village awoke to the rare sight of constables moving briskly through its quiet lanes. Word spread quickly. Justice, long delayed, was finally at hand. The widow, pale and resigned, was escorted from her cottage. Though she said little, the look in her eyes betrayed both defiance and despair. Villagers gathered at their gates, some whispering in shock, others shaking their heads with sorrow. The authorities, once dismissive of Miss Marple's gentle warnings, now bowed to her wisdom. Inspector Graves removed his hat as he passed her garden gate. "You were right, Miss Marple," he admitted gravely. As ever, she gave only a small nod, for she had no taste for triumph in matters where lives were lost. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead began to settle once more. The church bells rang on Sunday, and children skipped along the lanes, their laughter bringing back a fragile sense of normalcy. Yet, beneath the surface, the villagers carried the weight of what had been revealed. That darkness could lurk even in the most familiar of kitchens, hidden behind the pages of a recipe book. Still, there was comfort in knowing the truth had been brought into the light. Neighbors grew a little kinder, conversations a little softer, as if aware of how easily suspicion and fear might have torn them apart. And in her garden, Miss Marple tended her roses, content not with recognition but with the quiet knowledge that justice, in its steady way, had been restored. The evening after the widow's arrest, St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale a long-held breath. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, lamps glowed behind lace curtains, and the sound of a kettle whistling drifted from one cottage to another. In her own sitting room, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair, a cup of tea steaming gently on the side table. The clink of china and the warmth of the fire offered a reassuring rhythm after days filled with unease. She thought, as she often did, about the paradox of village life, the appearance of peace masking 1,000 small dramas. The bake sales, the church teas, the neighborly visits, all carried an air of innocence. Yet within them lay shadows of envy, greed, and desperation. Human nature, she reflected, was not unlike her rose garden. A bloom might look perfect from afar, but upon closer inspection, one might discover thorns hidden beneath velvet petals. And yet, the thought did not darken her mood. Quite the contrary, it strengthened her appreciation for the gentler aspects of life. A kind word from a neighbor, a fresh loaf left at her doorstep, a child's laughter echoing across the lane. These were the things that endured, even when darker truths were revealed. She sipped her tea, savoring the simple comfort. The recipe book, now locked away as evidence, had been more than a household trinket. It was a reminder of how easily secrets could slip into the fabric of ordinary life. Still, Miss Marple knew that for every shadow discovered, there was light to be found in the steadfast goodness of those around her. The fire crackled softly, and with a faint smile, she allowed herself a rare luxury, peaceful silence. Thank you, dear friends, for joining me on this journey through the lanes and parlors of St. Mary Mead, where the quiet clink of teacups can mask the most extraordinary secrets. I hope you enjoyed unraveling the murder hidden in the recipe book, a tale that reminded us all how even the simplest objects, a handwritten recipe, a familiar smile, a neighbor's gentle nod, may conceal layers of truth waiting to be discovered. If you found yourself leaning closer as the clues fell into place, or smiling at Miss Marple's quiet brilliance, then I invite you to linger a little longer in our circle of mystery lovers. Your thoughts are always welcome. Was there a moment that surprised you most? Did you, perhaps, suspect the widow before the final unveiling? Share your reflections in the comments below. They are the sparks that keep our storytelling fire alive. And, of course, if you would like more evenings steeped in suspense and cozy charm, do remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the little bell so you never miss the next mystery waiting in the wings. Every gesture of support helps keep these tales alive, drawing us back together for another fireside gathering of intrigue. But before we part, let me leave you with just the faintest whisper of what lies ahead. For even as Miss Marple rests in her cottage, tea cooling at her side, a gentle tap is heard at the door. When she rises, she finds an envelope slipped discreetly through the letterbox. No name upon it, only the faint scent of lavender clinging to the paper. What secrets might it hold? A warning? A plea for help? Or something far stranger still? The village, it seems, is never as quiet as it appears. And so, dear listeners, stay tuned for the next tale, where another puzzle waits to be untangled, and where Miss Marple's sharp eyes will once again pierce through the veil of the ordinary. Until then, thank you for sharing this story with me. May your evenings be cozy, your tea warm, and your curiosity always keen.